Turkish Airlines presents Business Africa.
Hello and welcome to this new edition of Business Africa. I'm Yasmina Alabasire. Here are the headlines. The ongoing war in Gaza is having a devastating impact on Egypt's economy. The country grapples with the consequences of a conflict raging at its northern border. The first APRA investment forum was held this week in Nairobi, aiming to create an African partnership for renewable energies. Tanzania is experiencing a tourist boom. The sector is expected to generate 7.5 billion euros in revenue by the end of 2024. The Egyptian economy, which has been struggling for years, is now severely impacted by the war in Gaza. The escalation of the conflict between Israel and its neighbors is yet another obstacle on Egypt's path to economic reforms and development.
Even before the war in Gaza broke out, Egypt was struggling with a critical dependence on food and fuel imports and costly short-term financing. Today, the situation is deteriorating further with the repercussions of the conflict. A UN report estimates that the total economic cost of the war in Gaza to the Egyptian economy will reach between $5.6 and $19.8 billion over the current and next tax year of 2024 to 2025. This means a loss of between 1.6 and 5.2% of average GDP, depending on the extent of the escalation of the conflict. The country suffers significant revenue losses due to the suspension of Israeli gas re-exportation. Suez Canal traffic and the tourism sector are likely to be the hardest hit, according to the report. Their revenues are expected to fall by between $3.7 and $13.7 billion over the current and next tax years. And projections for the coming months are worrying. Unemployment could reach 9.1% in the event of a serious escalation of the conflict. These factors exacerbate a crisis already aggravated by the war in Ukraine, in addition to unsustainable debt and a cost of living crisis that has lasted since 2022.
We welcome Hicham Lemesi, a geopolitical analyst and the secretary of the Chypre Institute in Geneva. Thank you for accepting our invitation, sir. Egyptian Prime Minister Mustafa Madbouli recently mentioned the possibility of a war economy. What would this mean for Egyptian citizens?
Mustafa Madbouli, the Prime Minister, is hinting at a dimension of the war economy. He is mainly referring to the general situation that Egypt is going through. We have an economic situation that is particularly difficult, marked notably by the country's debt exceeding $166 billion and a debt service of about $30 billion per year. The debt situation arises at a time when there is no genuine economic and financial return that would allow Egypt to access new sources of revenue. Beyond that, there is also a very serious regional security risk, with a potential, though marginal, possibility of the conflict expanding into Sinai and Egypt, or even causing very serious political unrest in Egypt. Due to the current happenings in Gaza and Lebanon, this could lead to an austerity policy, or at the very least, a policy aimed at preparing the country for the possibility of a war with Israel.
Foreign investments showed an upward trend in the second half of 2024. Could this trend be hindered by the latest escalation in Lebanon?
These investments are strongly tied to those from Gulf countries that invest in Egypt, simply because the political situation in Egypt is very delicate, as is the economic situation I described. The over-indebtedness leads certain Gulf countries, particularly Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, to want to indirectly assist Egypt while benefiting from it. This explains the rise in investment in Egypt. However, one should note that the political situation in Egypt could seriously deteriorate, linked to growing unrest in Cairo and other Egyptian cities. Concerning the situation in Gaza and the relatively passive stance of the Egyptian government, moreover, the general regional image does not favor Egypt as a destination, whether from a tourism perspective or regarding foreign direct investment.
Last question. Does the current regime have the ability to transform the Egyptian economic model into one less vulnerable to external shocks?
When discussing an economic model, one should note that Sisi's entire policy in recent years has been very ambitious economically to promote a more resilient Egyptian economic model with very large investments across a range of sectors. However, it also suffers from other issues, the poverty of a very significant portion of the population, which is an obstacle to its development as it necessitates subsidizing a number of basic products, particularly foodstuffs. It's also important to recognize that Egypt suffers from two other issues: relatively low level of training among Egyptians in technical professions and the relatively low number of Egyptians reaching higher education. Another crucial element to consider is the country's weak industrial capacity and a relatively fragile and small network of small and medium-sized industrial enterprises compared to a country of 110 million inhabitants.
Hicham Lamisi, thank you for your time. From October 14 to 16, the inaugural Accelerated Partnership for Renewables in Africa APRA Forum was held in Nairobi. Here's a look at 3 days of debates aimed at unlocking funding for green industrialization on the continent.
To realize potentials from renewable energy, stakeholders met at the Accelerated Partnership for Renewables in Africa, APRA, in Nairobi, the Kenyan capital, to prioritize mobilization of finance, engagement of the private sector, and capacity building, as well as technical assistance for renewable.
We need a grid, pipeline, port that are interconnected, that are flexible and balanced. We need markets that are designed for renewables, so based on long-term contract. We need strengthening the capacity of the institution that have to deal with the management of a decentralized energy system. It is more complex to manage the centralized, old-style energy system based on fossil fuels. And we need workers, skilled workforce.
While some countries have begun the transition, others remain way behind. According to delegates at the APRA Investment Forum, African countries need to show commitment to cut down dependence on energy from fossil fuels, which have been their main source of energy for over a century.
Climate change really is the cause of some of the challenges that we're experiencing on the continent. And so for us to be able to tackle that, we need to change our energy systems, because energy really is what has caused, or is a large part of the emissions that have been caused into the world. So to do that, we need to decarbonize from our energy system now and bring in renewable energy. And this is where the energy transition comes in.
Delegates at this forum say there is the need for countries to ensure that Africa's energy transition is not delayed.
By 2025, Tanzania aims to triple the number of international tourists and boost a sector that's become essential to its economy. Tourism now contributes to 17% of the GDP, making it the third largest employer and the top source of foreign exchange in the country.
Tanzania's tourism sector is booming. Edgar Mwambene, who started his tour business during the COVID-19 pandemic, says the country's wide range of attractions makes it easy for him to do business.
I always tell my guests, even a month, you won't finish all the attractions. It's like there's so much to explore, so much to see in Tanzania.
The government credits the 2022 film The Royal Tour for boosting tourism. It notes that this year has been outstanding.
Tanzania has received more than 2 million international visitors. This is the highest number reached in the country's history and has generated $3.5 billion in revenue.
The government says it is now targeting 5 million visitors by 2025, mainly from China. Experts say the key is to promote all parts of the country.
They shouldn't just promote one area and forget about others. So the southern and northern tourism circuit, which are all part of Tanzania, should be promoted.
The Tanzanian government has released a new tourism film this year dubbed Amazing Tanzania. It believes this will help increase the sector's contribution to the economy, which currently stands at 17.2%.
In Tanzania, there are around 1.5 million people working in the tourism sector, either directly or indirectly. For the government, news of a growing tourism industry presents an opportunity to create more jobs and with it, better lives for citizens. Isaac Lukanda for Africanews, Dar es Salaam.
That wraps this edition. Thank you for watching. The news continues on our platforms and on Africanews.com.
Business Africa was presented by Turkish Airlines.